Welcome to TISConversations, where we discuss issues related to understanding life from a trauma-informed lens. I'm Heather Forbes of the Beyond Consequences Institute. In today's session, we're going to have a dynamic conversation with Rick Lavoie to talk about parenting in difficult times, back to basics. So welcome, Rick.
I'm delighted to be with you, Heather.
All right, so you are the author of several books, but most notably the Motivation Breakthrough, and It's So Much Work to Be Your Friend, which I just love that title. And I also want to make sure that our listeners know that you have an incredible video out also. It's been out for a while, but it's still incredibly popular.
Well, it was actually it's ancient. People are disappointed when they meet me because I did the video in 1987. Somebody said to me one time, "You look older," and I said, "You probably don't look a lot like your 1987 video either." But it was a labor of love where we took a group of people together without learning disabilities and contrived the material so they actually experienced what it was like to have learning challenges, and then discussed it afterwards. And you're right, it's been out there for almost 40 years and it continues to sell.
Well, I think it's so relevant even today. And speaking of today, this is such a challenging time for everyone, but especially for parents. So I really appreciate you coming on and giving us a little bit of insight and have some conversation around how can we really help our kids be able to understand what's going on, help parents be able to understand. And so one thing that I just know that when I'm working with parents is that most adults kind of think that kids are just little adults, which they're not. And they're developmentally very, very different. And every child up to even to 25 years old and even beyond that, there's different stages of development. So I know that you and I had talked earlier, wanted to talk more about this idea of development. So sort of get us jump started on why that's important for parents to understand developmental stages.
As I travel around the country, and I'm sure it's the same for you, and get emails and things from folks, it's not uncommon that someone will say, somewhat tongue in cheek, that they wish kids came with an instruction booklet. You know, you get an instruction booklet when you buy a new toaster or a new refrigerator, but when the kid is handed to you in the hospital, you don't get an instruction booklet, and there never will be an instruction booklet. But in a sense, there is. And that is, if I were king, I would insist that every parent and every teacher take and pass a course in human development. Because my bias is many of the problems we have with our kids, if we truly understood the development of children and how they develop in a fairly predictable way, we'd avoid those problems. And one of my favorite stories apropos to that is I love watching kids. One of my areas of study is friendships and kids and how kids develop relationships. So I just love watching a playground of kids. And we went to my wife, we live in Cape Cod, and we went to the beach last summer. And I'm pretty good at looking at a group of kids and picking out the kid I think who's going to give me a story. And sure enough, this woman arrived with 7 or 8 little kids, ages probably 3 to 10. Some of them were hers and some of them were neighbors' kids that she was helping out with. And they were sitting on the beach having a good time. And there was one little guy, and I said, I'm going to watch him because he's going to give me a story. Sure enough, he went up to his mother and said, Mom, my towel's all wet. Can I get a new towel? And she said, well, I only brought 1 towel apiece. Why did your towel get wet? Well, I took it down and going to make a sandcastle on it, put the wet sand in the towel, and now it's wrecked. She said, okay, I'm going to give you a towel, but you remember this, it's the last dry towel. It's your sister's towel. Do not get it wet. Do not get it wet. She gives the towel to the little 5-year-old, puts it around his shoulder. He's sitting in the blanket. After a while, he gets up, begins to walk the beach, starts walking closer to the water. I'm thinking this is not going to end well. He walks into the water, wrapped up in the towel, but keeping his arms up in the air so the towel wouldn't get wet, and dutifully trying to keep it dry. And somebody throws him a frisbee. He reaches for the frisbee. The towel falls in the water and it's soaking wet. So he picks it up and brings it out and brings it up to his mother, and sheepishly gives it to her, and she starts, why did you leave the blanket? Why did you go toward the water? Why did you walk into the water up to your knees? Why did you let go of the towel? And, you know, Heather, I'm sitting on the beach and I'm thinking I could solve this situation in 3 words. Why did he get off the blanket? Why did he walk toward the water? Why did he let go of the towel? Because he's 5. Because he's 5. 5-year-olds don't have what's called consequential thought. You and I have a consequential thought. You know that if you want to keep something dry, the closer you get it to the water, the bigger chance it's going to be that it's going to get wet. Kids don't have that. So why did he do it? Simply because he's 5. And if we understood development, another example I love is one of the things we get angry about with our adolescents. All you do is eat and sleep. All you do is eat and sleep. Okay, let's look at that from a developmental point of view. Adolescence is the second biggest growth spurt in the human experience. You can gain 30 pounds and 6 inches in the period of a year. Adolescence is the second biggest growth spurt. The biggest growth spurt is infancy. You can double your weight and double your length in the period of 2 years. What do infants do to fuel that incredible growth? They eat and they sleep. And the doctors say make sure he gets plenty of sleep and plenty to eat. The reason the adolescent is eating and sleeping all the time is the same reason the infant does, to fuel this incredible growth. I've never seen a parent get mad at an infant for eating and sleeping all the time, and yet we get upset with our adolescents when they're doing the same thing for the same reason. And if we could buy into the fact that 6-year-olds are going to whine, 8-year-olds are scattered, 9-year-olds will cheat when you're playing a game. Once you buy into that developmental thing, I think you avoid a lot of the problems you have with kids.
And I think what's so interesting about that is that this isn't in parenting books. When you look at parenting books, it's all about how to make this child do this, what this technique is about, how to count to 3 and magic's going to happen. And it never mentions development. And so it's so important for us to be able to understand where our kids are in that developmental stage. And you know what? I also know, working with kids who have been impacted by trauma, is that developmental stage is going to be different, so that chronologically they might be 8 years old, but developmentally you might have a 5-year-old. So when you ask that 8-year-old to set the table and they aren't setting the table because they're completely overwhelmed, it's like asking a 5-year-old to set the table. So what do you also see? I know you work with a lot of kids with special needs. Is that also something that you have to be able to shift and sort of guide that developmental age that might be different from their chronological age?
Right. And I think it's remaining mindful of development. And the frustration that I find, Heather, the information that I just gave you has been available for 100 years. I mean, we've known for decades how kids develop. And I think we kind of forget that. And I think you're right. The parenting books talk about how to mess with development. And I think kids develop in a pretty predictable way. And every time you try to mess around with it, I think that's when you get in trouble. You know, that if you remember in the 80s, when the big deal was taking these really brilliant 12-year-old kids and putting them in college because they could handle the academics. Yeah, but developmentally, they weren't ready for college. And many of them, unfortunately, crashed and burned. Development is a pretty predictable thing, and we shouldn't mess with it. In terms of special ed, what we're finding, and of course I'm dealing now with dozens and dozens of families of special needs kids, is the regression back to in developmental. I mean, a parent will say, "My God, he's acting like he's 6." Yeah, because exactly what he's doing. The stress of what he's going through, as you well know, the stress of what he's going through is sending him back to a previous developmental time. But once you expect that and understand that, you're not going to get upset if the 12-year-old becomes very whiny, because you know that's part of the package. That's part of the way he's responding to this extraordinarily difficult time we're going through.
I think that's a great example right now during the pandemic. I've always said that when you stress, you regress, meaning you're going to regress back to an earlier developmental stage. I just know, working with schools in the past, when during state testing, you all of a sudden you had 8-year-olds that were wetting the bed like the 3-year-old, right? Because you're going backwards in the stress. And that's happening right now with the pandemic. And I really think that that's such a mindful thing for parents to keep in their forefront, is that when you see that child that normally acts like the 10-year-old, and like you said, they're all of a sudden acting like the 6-year-old, it's not that they're being bad. It's that they are regressing back to an earlier stage of their development that was a little bit maybe more comfortable. And that's where they're finding their balance again during these just really challenging times. So what's your advice to parents when they're seeing this? And, and again, like, you might see this 13-year-old budding young man who's acting like a little boy. How do you jump that discrepancy between what you see physically, but what you see behaviorally?
Well, that's one of the great challenges for parents at this time. I think one of the things you do is provide as positive a role model as you can. having very honest talks with them about the fact that these are difficult times, and reminding them, making them aware of the fact that some of the behaviors you're seeing from them are a bit regressive. If the kid is capable of handling that kind of conversation, to say, I know this is stressful. I can tell by the way you're acting. Do you need to talk about it? Do you need to talk to somebody else? I have a great concern about what's going to happen to this generation of kids. And I don't mean to bring the party down here, but they're missing a huge part of their upbringing. I'm a school guy. I'm 70 years old. I've been a school guy for 65 years, from when I started in the kindergarten at 5 years old. And I went through my whole life as a student and then as a teacher and then administrator. And I work on my calendar, and my wall runs September to June, not January to December like everybody else's does. And one of the comforts about school for kids and for those of us who teach is that there's a ritual to it. You meet a group of people in September you never knew before, you get to know them, you celebrate the holidays together, you slog through the winter, you celebrate the spring, and then you say goodbye and go on another experience. That's a natural rhythm and ritual of school-age kids. And we got a generation of kids that have really had that through no fault or choice of their own or anybody else's. They've had that ritual and that rhythm taken away. So we certainly shouldn't be surprised that we see them regress to previous behaviors that had been successful. When he was 7 and he was whiny, mom and dad hugged him. Now he's 11, so he needs mom and dad's attention. He's going to revert to the last time he remembered being beloved and getting the hugs he needed.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point, that rhythm and that predictability. And that's why I see this pandemic as literally a traumatic experience, because the things that are supposed to happen in November with Thanksgiving and then December with the holidays, and the things that traditionally are part of our children's just balance and the way that they find their homeostasis, all of that's gone. And so I think that really just goes back to how important the family culture is going to be, the immediate family culture that within the household, again, that safety piece of where you are with who's at the home, is that the stronger you build those relationships, that has to be the part that is able to, I guess, replace those normal traditional things that we're not going to have, whether it's school or holidays or whatever. So the relationships, I think, for families is going to be so critical. But again, it's hard to build relationship when you see your 13-year-old acting like an 8-year-old. So now we're kind of back to just opening your mind and understanding things are different for our kids.
Well, you used the word safety, which I think is so important in this, because kids are accustomed to seeing mom and dad in charge. I fell down, I hurt myself, mom will know what to do. The toilet won't flush, dad will know what to do. And so they're naturally turning to their parents for solutions to this, and the parents have no solution. The parents are being victimized by this pandemic as much as, if not more than, the kids are. And so it's a scary time for kids. And that's why your stuff, and not to be patronizing, but your book is dog-eared on my desk because I keep referring to it to give advice to people at these difficult times. It's very predictable that kids would respond this way. So we need to understand it's just part of what they're going through.
And you know what? I'm kind of reflecting back on your book, The Motivation Breakthrough. I'm going to kind of divert from our script here because this is where I feel like I want to expand this a little bit more, is that motivation for our children is lacking. I know adults, that myself included, the level of motivation, I have to dig deep these days. And so how would you suggest to parents then of helping our kids find their internal motivation during these, again, challenging times, again, when they're developmentally regressing? Any thoughts on that topic?
Well, I don't know. The phrase on my business card is kids need love most when they deserve it least. I think as the kids begin to act up and disrupt and revert, that's the time they really need you to be there. The simple solutions, the simple things that parents do of showing their affection for kids, letting them know that they appreciate what they're going through, those things become more and more important. We tend to look, we get a new situation on our hands and we tend to look for new solutions. My thing maybe is just amp up the old solutions, amp up the things work for him. What has motivated him in the past? What turns him on? What makes him feel special? And just keep amping those things up. If we're going a little bit off course here too, I ran into something that I'm sharing with a whole lot of people, that I find very, very valuable for these times. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called the Stockdale Paradox, and it's a very Reader's Digest version. It's Jim Stockdale was an admiral in the Navy, and was a long-term prisoner in Vietnam. Actually, even longer than John McCain, and went through all the terrible things that Senator McCain went through. And when he came out, he worked with a group of psychologists, and they came up with a thing called the Stockdale Paradox. And it's very interesting for these times. He said the people who didn't make it in the prison camp, the people who suffered tremendous mental breakdowns and just didn't make it, were the optimists. He said, it seems kind of counterintuitive, but he said the guys who were constantly saying they'll let us out for Christmas to be sure, or there's a big Vietnam holiday, they'll let us out for that for sure. It'll be only 2 more weeks. The ones that kept thinking it was going to go away were the ones who came out the other end of it not mentally healthy. The people who said, I can't control that I'm here, I can't control when I leave, so I'm going to devote all my energy to thinking of what I'm going to do when I get out. I'm going to build a garage behind the house. I'm going to learn how to play the guitar. Those are the people who made it. And I think, apropos to this, I still hear people that I know and love saying, well, maybe by Christmas we'll be able, or maybe by Thanksgiving. The chances are that 2028 Christmas and 2028 Thanksgiving, and those aren't going to happen. And so to give advice to kids, instead of maybe it'll be better next week, maybe it'll be better next week, which we would tend to do, being optimistic people, might not be the best way to go. The best way to go might be to say, no, there won't be Christmas this year, and we're going to make it as special as we can, but that's not going to happen. It's just a different way of looking what we're going through. I was intrigued by it.
I really like that a lot, because you're right. If you keep thinking, okay, well, next week and next week, you continually get disappointed. And that's
Yeah,
not good for
exactly.
your mental health. So I like that sort of projection. All right, well, what will I do next Christmas? I think that's fair enough. Or what will I do next
Yeah,
Thanksgiving? And that we let this little bit trickling in. It's going to be bad, and just accept it. And
yeah,
I think that there is that sense of, okay, what about right now? What can I do right now? Not looking forward to next week, because it might not look that way. There's so much unpredictability that helping ourselves first, of course, and then to be able to let our kids be able to find their way through this. You know what? Here's the other thing that I believe is that our kids know how to innately find their balance, and we have to be able to give them that space to be able to do that as well. Sometimes when we put our own requirements on how happy they should be, or how optimistic or whatever they should be, that's a lot of stress for our kids. And so
yeah.
I like that a lot. I think that you're, looking for that future of not tomorrow, but the future beyond that.
And telling kids how to feel. Don't be sad. I'm cold, put on a coat, where we take our feelings and project them on the kid. Don't cry. Well, maybe he needs to cry. Maybe he needs to cry, and kind of letting him set the tone, and letting him guide you rather than you constantly trying to tell him how to feel. Kind of go with his feelings.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm thinking about. That's great. Let me swing back around to when we were talking about developmental issues, because this is a question I know I get, I'm sure you get a lot as well, is that how does a parent know if it's a developmental issue or they're just being bad? I mean, I can hear so many parents' voices on that. How do you know if to give them a little slack, or do you need to reprimand them at that moment? And so how do you help a parent then to see this, not from the behavioral standpoint, but from the developmental, no matter what?
Yeah, it's a difficult call to make. And I think when I think of the mistakes that I've made raising our 3 kids, were times that I misread that message. Here's my bias. I would always lean on the side of it being developmental before I label a kid as being bad or immoral, or not having a moral core. You're a bad person. I would look at the development first. It's difficult but if you lean on development, you're going to respond to it by being kind and generous and helpful, which I think is probably the way you would want to go anyway. It's a difficult call to make. You got to look for patterns in behavior. There's a strategy that I teach teachers called differentiated recording. And what you do is you make a little note. When the kid has a bad day, you make a note of everything that's going on in the environment. Next time he has a bad day, do it again. And the third time, do it again. And then look at your 3 pieces of paper and see what's common, what's going on in this kid's environment that's making it happen. Because many times you'll find something, there is something toxic going on, maybe something not even related to what's happening at home, something happening at school, that's something toxic going on. You can identify it and try to remove that. It's a difficult call to make. To determine what's developmental and what is the kid just acting out.
Right. And then let's talk about that acting out, because if they're acting out, rather than just seeing as being mischievous or non-compliant or rude or disrespectful, some of these words that we put on top of it, it is also then about saying, well, why? Why is this child acting out? I mean, our kids don't really inherently just want to be bad. There's typically a communication behind that, right? So what is this child communicating by their negative behavior?
Yeah, there's no upside for a kid being bad. Generally, when a kid acts out or misbehaves, there's generally a reason. And I find that in the overwhelming number of reasons, it comes down to this little bumper sticker, which is that at any given point in time, any kid would prefer to be viewed as bad than dumb. Anytime you put a kid in the position of choosing between looking bad or looking dumb, he will choose to look bad. So you're the basketball coach, you got the kids sitting up in the bleachers at the end of practice, and you realize, gee, we got 5 more minutes of practice. You say, Michael, Frank, come on down. I want the 2 of you to demonstrate that passing drill we learned yesterday. And as Frank comes off the stands, he slaps some other kid in the back of the head. You need to automatically think, why did he do that? Well, he did it because he couldn't remember the drill. And he's coming off the stands and he's thinking, I don't remember if I go to your left or your right on that drill. I'm going to look dumb in front of the coach. I'm going to look dumb in front of the other kids. But if I slap this kid in the back of the head, the coach will throw me out of practice. And everybody will think I'm bad, but nobody will think I'm dumb. Particularly in early adolescence and adolescence, their fear of embarrassment often, so many times when we get in trouble with kids in middle childhood and adolescence, is because they perceive that they're going to be in a situation, they're going to look dumb, and so they would rather act bad. So if grandma is always very critical of Johnny when he visits grandma's, he's going to act out when he doesn't want to go to grandma's. I don't want to get dressed. What he's basically saying is, I would rather have you think I'm bad and won't get dressed than think I'm dumb by having grandma embarrass me in front of the family. You're absolutely right, Heather. Don't want to say always, but pretty close to always, there's a reason for that behavior.
Right. And I think that's such beautiful insight that our kids don't want to feel dumb. And I'm thinking right now during the pandemic, when we are doing a lot of remote learning, I've heard from a lot of parents and teachers how kids aren't focusing, they're goofing off. If they're on Zoom, they're sitting there changing their backgrounds. And I would suspect because learning with remote learning, through Zoom and the video platforms, it's really tough. It's such a different way to learn where you're not in that kinesthetic place where you can touch and feel and connect. Right. That I would suspect that a lot of the quote bad behaviors that our kids are showing during remote learning is very much tied to that concept that you just talked about.
It absolutely is. And I think we've got to recognize we have 2 grandkids, and a granddaughter is taken to distance learning like a duck to water. She loves it. She enjoys it. She's asking for extra work. And her brother just has not taken to it at all. Just doesn't get it that way. He's such a relationship kind of based person. The idea of not being able to go and talk to the teacher whenever he wants and talk to his friends, he's just not making any kind of progress on it. I hate to say it, but it will be a lost year for this kid that he's going to have to make up sometime. He just can't plug into it.
Yeah. So I think, again, that's something to really be aware of, and not to get aggravated at it, but to have that deeper level of understanding as to why. You can't force it, and I think this is what we often see is when parents try to say, no, you got to stay focused. You got to do this. You got to do that. This is your school. You're going to fail. And putting those kinds of negative messages onto a student or their child who is already stressed out, it seems logical that we would know that that's not okay. But when you are the parent and you're stressed and you're trying to get your work done and the child's supposed to be sitting there in their school and they're not getting their work done, it can really be such a recipe for explosions and just a bad day.
It's just not a normal way to have a childhood. There's nothing normal about this. No generation has ever been asked to do this kind of thing. I mean, every generation has had their challenges. I mean, kids in London during the World War II were living in subways. I mean, every generation seems to have its challenges, but this is a different one. And and like the rest of us, we're looking forward to this being in our rearview mirror so we can get back to the kind of teaching we like to do.
Right. And so with that, let me ask you this about the idea of using positive feedback and what you call the futility of punishment when they're stressed out. So let's kind of talk on that level of understanding why punishment really is quite ineffective.
Well, I think one of the great misunderstandings that many teachers and parents have, we know the difference between positive and negative feedback. Positive feedback is reward, recognition, praise. Negative feedback is punishment and taking something away. We all know that. I think what we forget is the kid's response to positive and negative feedback. And that is simply positive feedback changes behavior, negative feedback only stops behavior. You can't change a kid's behavior by punishing them. If I punish John for picking on Jimmy outside my office, John will no longer pick on Jimmy outside my office. He'll pick on Jimmy other places, and he'll pick on other kids outside my office, but he won't pick on Jimmy outside my office. All I've accomplished is I've stopped that behavior. I've done nothing to change his behavior. I've just stopped the behavior. And so to try to change a kid's behavior by negative feedback is really hammering on cold steel. It's just not going to happen. Conversely, if I look out the window and I see Johnny being nice to Jimmy and helping him do something, and I call Johnny in and I say, hey, I just saw what you did. That was a really nice thing you just did. I'm going to give your mom a call and tell her what I just saw. And then I walk down the hall with my arm around his shoulder and bump into the principal and say, Mike, let me tell you what I just saw Johnny do, and give him positive feedback for doing the right thing. That's going to change the behavior. Every time I do this, I have to remind people, I'm not saying we should never punish kids. I ran residential schools for 30 years for 200 kids a year and raised 3 kids of our own. There's sometimes kids need to be punished, but you need to do it with the idea you're not changing anything. If you want to change the behavior, you got to catch them being good and reinforce that behavior.
Right. And I think what I also like to kind of add to that as far as punishment is about holding kids accountable. And I think that's where people sort of miss the mark, is that they want to hold kids accountable, which absolutely they need that. That's part of us guiding them and helping them to change. The accountability is so fear-based and so punitive that it actually only makes kids mad at you. So I think there has to be a distinction as well.
If you're a parent who's constantly punishing the kids, that's basically your mode operandi. There's a woman on television who said one time that the only reason she gave her teenagers cell phones is so she could take them away when she was bad, which mother of the year there. But the reality is that if you're constantly punishing your kids, in a sense, you are bullying them. The definition of bullying being using power and influence over somebody else. Please don't be surprised then if your kids become the neighborhood bullies, because you basically taught them that. You've modeled the way that I control the people in my life is to make them fearful and to threaten them. I remember walking to a shopping mall one time and I saw this young dad. He's walking with his 2 kids, maybe 7 and 5, 2 little boys. And the 7-year-old is bullying the 5-year-old and pushing the 5-year-old. And finally, the father got mad and he turned to the 7-year-old and went crack and slapped him across the face. And he looked at him and he said, that'll teach you to hit your little brother. And I thought, you're exactly right, genius. That's the smartest thing you said all week. That will teach him to hit his little brother. I get frustrated with you, I hit you. You get frustrated with your little brother, you hit your brother. And the cycle of violence continues. You're right. That will teach him to hit his little brother. If we only could recognize that punishment, sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes all you want to do is stop the behavior. But don't punish the kid and then complain he didn't change. I can almost guarantee you he won't. He'll change only through positive feedback.
I'm just laughing at that example. It's so ironic. I mean, children learn by modeling. I mean, that is a proven fact. You can see that from the very early days of being a parent, that your kids will pick up on things. Even if you say one time you say a cuss word, and then sure enough, your kid picks that up very, very easily. And you're like, where'd that come from? So,
and of course, then we overreact to it and they say it more and more. Absolutely.
It is. So I have this quote down that you had written to me in one of our emails, and it said, Dr. Seuss reminds us that sometimes the questions are complicated and the answers are simple. So expand on that one.
Well, I think it was what I was saying earlier, that we've got a new situation, so we're looking for new solutions, and maybe the solutions are the things we know that work: establishing relationships with our kids, having routines and predictability. I think one of the mistakes I've seen parents make is they've taken this opportunity, if you will, of the pandemic and just throwing structure to the wind, and the kids can have breakfast whenever they want, and sometimes we'll have dinner in front of the TV, and sometimes that was a very well intentioned but a really big mistake. I'm finding the families that are functioning better are the ones that have maintained what they were doing before the pandemic, kind of a regular time for breakfast, regular kind of rules. You pick up your toys before you can have dinner, and kind of going back to what you're doing before that was working. Again, there's a natural tendency to look for some silver bullet in all this that's going to solve all the problems. Maybe we just need to go back to the way we were doing things before the pandemic and get through that way.
I like that. And that's why we're calling this back to basics, because you're right. Having that structure creates a lot of stability because kids know what's going to happen next. We're living through a time we literally don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or the next day. And so within the household, within the family, if you create that normalcy that you've always had dinner at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, that kids will then have some sense of all rightness, right? I mean, when you don't, trauma happens by surprise. And so we want to make sure that in our families are then creating as much normalcy and routine and structure, because we had enough surprises in the outside world. A lot of kids went to school one day and boom, all of a sudden the next they're remote. And the next day they're going back to school. Oh no, now we're remote. The in and out and fluctuation is creating so much stress for our kids. I totally agree with that. Because the external world is so chaotic. They're in school one day, then the school shuts down, they're back at home, then they're back at school. That the family's ability to create that structure and routine and their internal little inner world will help them to cope with the outer world.
You're absolutely right. And I think parents sometimes get their backs up a little bit when we talk about structure. I think people misinterpret structure as being militaristic and very harsh and unforgiving. It's not. I use the word predictability. As you just said, the fact that the kid's world is predictable. That he knows they're going to have dinner at a certain time. There are certain rules for keeping the house clean and that kind of thing. And you maintain those. It gives kids a great sense of comfort. They might chomp at the bit a little bit and say they don't enjoy it, but in a sense they do.
I know with kids who I've worked with that have been impacted by trauma, one of the things, and I know my son who was impacted by trauma, he was adopted out of Russia when he was 2.5 years old. I just remember as a parent, every minute when he was able to talk and we were having conversation, he'd be like, "What's happening next? What are we doing next? What are we doing next? What are we doing next?" And I'm like, "We're just taking a break, leave me alone. Because the reason he was asking that question, as aggravated as I would get not knowing, but the reason behind it was, I have to know I'm safe. I have to know what's going to happen next because I don't want any more surprises. I can't handle this. I got to know what's going to happen next, right? There was this sense of urgency to know, am I going to be okay about what happens next? Having that routine can really help kids be able to settle back into that sense of emotional safety that all of us need right now.
And exactly what your son was going through. I get frustrated sometimes that even professionals will use the terms depression and anxiety interchangeably as if mean the same thing, when actually they're quite different. Not to be cute about it, but basically the depressed people worry about the past, anxious people worry about the future. If you know someone in a depression, they're reflecting on something they've lost in their past. Anxiety is very different. It's you're worried about the future. And what I'm seeing with some of the kids I'm working with, not that there's a depression over this. I think adults are becoming depressed about it, but kids are becoming extraordinarily anxious for exactly the reason your son did. What's going to happen next? I need to know that there's something predictable down the line. And that's why, again, I think it's so important to maintain routines at home.
I think that's such a great distinction between the two. Yes, the anxiety is through the roof for our children and our parents. It has been so great to have you here today, Rick. Is there anything else you want to add as we wrap this up?
Yeah, just to say that that we got to provide our kids. We understand what our kids are going through. This is a very, very difficult time for them, difficult time for all of us. And just keeping those relationships alive and realizing it doesn't take much. If I could close with a quick story.
Yes.
When I was my first year teaching, I had a little boy in my class. It was a residential special needs school. He was about 8 years old. Wonderful, wonderful spirit. His name was Jordy. Wonderful spirit, but fighting the battle on several fronts. He had learning problems and language problems and math problems and comprehension, even orthopedic problems. He had a leg that gave him some trouble, but a great, great spirit. And the way I used to teach my class was that he would come. I had him in a one-to-one language arts tutorial. I had him for an hour a day. And he would come in every day and I give him a notebook and he'd write something down that he had done that day or the day before and then give it to me. I take it home, read it, make a comment, bring it back in, give it to him. The next morning he'd write something that he had done. So it was sort of keeping a journal or a diary through the semester. And one day he came running or, frankly, limping into my office. He had some orthopedic things and he came rushing into my office. Mr. Lavoie, give me my notebook. I got to write something down. Something great happened yesterday. I want to write it down. So I gave him the notebook and he wrote something down and gave it back to me. And I tossed it in my briefcase and didn't open it till that evening. And opened my briefcase and opened his notebook and I read what he wrote and I cut it out and I had it framed and it is sitting right in front of me. It has been in every office that I've had for the last 65 years. And this is what Jordy wrote down. Yesterday was a really great day. I almost caught a ball. The ball came to him at recess. He didn't make a total fool of himself. He almost caught the ball and that made his day. And that's a daily reminder. Again, it's hung in every office I've ever had. A daily reminder to me that it's the little things. It's the little things you can do for kids. Those little acts of kindness that show how strongly you feel about them, how much you care about them, how much you love them, how responsible you feel for them. Those little acts of kindness that we can sprinkle in our kids every day. That's what's going to make the big difference of getting kids through this. I truly believe it.
Oh, I totally do believe that too, especially right now. There aren't big things going on. There's big things that are unsafe going on, but in our houses, we seem to be like, oh, I'm kind of bored. No, you're right. Look for those little things. I love that. That's really I think we have to stop the way we used to do things and do the things that are more about how we can be in this moment right now. And if it is that almost got the ball, then that's what we celebrate. And that's what we have to be able to bring us the joy back. It's our responsibility to bring that joy back into our lives. And it's all the perception, isn't it? It's just absolutely what we look at.
Absolutely. That's a big responsibility during all of this, I think.
All right. Well, I so much appreciate this conversation and you all stay tuned. We'll have the next episode with Rick Lavoie, and we'll be talking more on the professional level from the educator's perspective of how to help our children. So thank you again for being with me and having this awesome conversation.
Absolutely my pleasure.
This has been TISConversations. I'm Heather Forbes with the Beyond Consequences Institute. For more trauma-informed resources, please visit beyondconsequences.com. Thanks for listening, and remember, love always prevails.